Hello, my name is Ryan McBride, and welcome to Critical Thinking for the Rest of Us. Today's lecture, Critical Thinking in Everyday Life. Welcome to the final lecture of Critical Thinking for the Rest of Us. As mentioned, today we are going to be talking about critical thinking in everyday life. This is the final lecture, so hopefully you brought your tissue boxes. The topic today, critical thinking in everyday life. We've done this a little bit throughout the series already. We've talked about how critical thinking impacts us in everyday life, but we're going to get a lot more focused and really try to give you some practical skills to take into your own life, action items effectively that you can actually begin to implement critical thinking in your own life. That way it's not all theoretical. You have some practical tools that you can put in your pocket for when you need to use them. So that's what we're going to be going over today. So specifically, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to critical thinking in everyday life, and then we're going to go over the following pro tips, or however you might want to call them. So we're going to talk about information overload. We're going to talk about media bias. We're going to talk about misinformation and disinformation. We're going to talk about decision making, problem solving, and then finally, communication. So this is no surprise to you at this point, but critical thinking is a crucial cognitive process that enables individuals to analyze, evaluate, and synthesize information effectively. In a world inundated with data, inundated with information, from news articles to social media posts, critical thinking serves as a guiding light, helping us navigate complex information environments. The ability to think critically is not merely an academic exercise. This is something we've tried to make clear in this series. It is a skill that permeates our daily lives, influencing how we make decisions and interact with the world around us. So to begin, information overload. We're all familiar with this. And if you're not familiar with it by title, you will be familiar with it by title after the end of this. So information overload is a phenomenon characterized by the overwhelming abundance of information that individuals encounter daily. This saturation can lead to decision fatigue, where the sheer volume of data makes it challenging to make informed choices. In evaluating news articles, social media posts, and various other data or information sources, the inability to manage this influx can lead to confusion and anxiety, to say the least, significantly hindering our cognitive processes. I shouldn't have to offer an argument here for whether or not you're suffering information overload, given the fact that we live in the information age. Specifically, we live in an information age where information is readily accessible. That's what that means. There's always been information, but now we have all of it happening literally all the time. When we have our cell phones, for instance, we have pretty much the whole known world at our fingertips. That's not maybe a great thing. It seems like it could be a good thing. It might actually not be a good thing. And here's why. Not all the information that we have coming into our minds is actually good. So we have to do things like filter it. So this is where the critical thinking tools comes in. So the first thing that I want to offer is when it comes to information overload and the negative impact that it has, one way of combating that is filtering your information sources. So filtering your social media, filtering your news outlets, etc. When you're filtering something, of course, you need a metric of some kind. What I've personally used in my past is thinking about information as an analogy to health. I believe I've used this example before, as an analogy for food and nutrition. So I have a pretty firm grasp of what a healthy diet is. Not always very good at it, but I know what that is. So if I use that analogy, if I use that analogically and say, well, what is healthy, nutritious information? Suddenly I have a new framework to think through. I'm probably not going to overeat. That's not eating healthy. So don't over-inform yourself. And of course, select healthy information. Little junk information is okay now and then, but focus on the core stuff. The big, make sure your diet consists of the most important information, whatever that might be. That, however, gives you a small framework to begin to think about this. Another thing, so thinking about the idea of like healthy income of information, one way to do this, of course, too, is prioritize your mental bandwidth. So this is really important, is making sure that you're maintaining your bandwidth. We live in a time where information is no longer, if it ever has been, given to us just for our benefit. It's also given to us for alternative reasons that aren't necessarily good for our well-being, such as influencing people, persuading people, coercing people, so on and so forth. And what this does is it shrinks our mental bandwidth, and it shrinks our capacity to think at all. And so another analogy you can use here to think about information overload is ask yourself, well, what is my bandwidth every day? Or how much CPU pressure can my brain maintain per day? And if I use that framework, thinking about what tasks, again, this is a computer metaphor here, what tasks are too resource intensive, or what information is too resource intensive and therefore should be canceled. That task should be ended if you open up your task manager in order to preserve that bandwidth. And then finally, with information overload, another great way to overcome it is, this is going to be really hard to convince you of this, but avoiding multitasking. We're not good at multitasking. We all know this too. If you've spent any time in schooling of any kind at this point and then been in a psychology course, it's one of the first things you'll learn in psychology is you can't multitask. You think you can, you can't. What you're doing is doing both things, or 3 things, or 4 or 5 or 20 things poorly, and none of them well. The only multitaskers that I know that are actually effective at it is drummers. And I've actually been thinking about this for myself. It's like, wait a minute, drummers multitask all the time and they do it really well. So is that like a counterexample? But we don't have to think about this too much. This is a little avenue for my own brain, but we're not really good at multitasking. Instead, what we ought to do, or one way to increase our bandwidth and decrease our information overload, is to do sequential task doing, however you say that. So using a sequential approach to our tasks. So instead of trying to, feed the baby, finish your applied ethics paper, or drive to KFC or whatever it is, maybe do that in an order. Maybe do that one at a time. That way you can devote your energies to perfecting each stage of that process. So those are a few ways of combating information overload. It's of course extremely hard to avoid information overload in the day and age that we live in, but it is possible. A lot of the times I think that we're given this sense of necessity. We have to be connected. We have to be inundated. We have to be just gobbling up information. But the question is this true? And what's best for us and best for our community in terms of how much information we take in? Next, media bias. So this is something that all of us deal with. This is especially acute in the US. We don't really have a lot of great news and media sources that are striving for non-biased information and striving for high-quality journalism. We have something like pretty okay journalism all the way down to sensational news entertainment sources, or entertainment channels masquerading as news channels, and opinion pieces and things. But in terms of quality information, quality news, it's a little sparse in the US. And so this, media bias ends up being something that if you find this kind of thing important, critical thinking, media bias is something you're going to have to think about. So media bias refers to the tendency of news outlets to present information in a manner that favors a particular agenda or perspective, often leading to a distortion of facts. This bias can significantly impact public perception, shaping how individuals understand events and issues. When certain viewpoints are consistently highlighted while others are marginalized, it creates an imbalanced narrative that can influence public opinion. It will influence public opinion, exacerbate divisions, and hinder informed decision-making. So how do we combat this? How do we overcome media bias or challenge it? First, cross-checking news sources to determine which use the soundest journalism techniques. So doing a little information on how is the information being collected and disseminated. So there are news channels, believe it or not, in the US that don't have journalists. They just are picking information up off the internet and sharing it with others. But there's no primary source journalism happening where, for instance, you send a news person over to I don't know, wherever it is, to actually collect this news on the ground and then to share it as it happened. We tend to think that this is less biased information because you're just describing facts, you're not interpreting them, right? And that's gets us into a conversation about what journalism is, of course, but analyzing those journalist techniques and thinking critically about, well, what constitutes good collection of information. So, for example, does one news source rely too much on sensational stories with little information versus other news sources that actually they have a staff of journalists? And yeah, they're probably politically biased. I think that's the thing, is like all journalists have opinions, right? But are they still able to set that aside and perform their jobs as critical thinkers? And so if you find yourself faced with, I don't know, like the Newsweek tabloid and something like New York Times, they have a dedicated staff of journalists. If you're comparing those two, the quality of the information there it's pretty clear, right? You might not like either for certain reasons, but the quality of the journalism can't be disputed there. Another example, does one news source offer charitable interpretations of opposing views? So what I meant by charitable is we've talked about the principles of charity and skepticism. So that's how I'm using this term here. So are news sources being charitable in their description of opposing views, or are they maligning the views as they're sharing them, or are they not even sharing them at all? Or are those opposing views being marginalized and not even being brought up? If that's the case, this is media bias. You might pause and consider that for a second. You're not being informed. And therefore, because you're not being informed, you're not being asked and allowed to participate as a critical thinker in the political dialogue of the society that you find yourself in, period. This is not to your benefit. It's to the benefit of the people sharing the biased information to you. Another thing to do, of course, is to discuss analyzing language use. We've talked kind of in a scattered manner, but we've talked about the use of rhetoric. Rhetoric is how we package our language and deliver it to our listeners, and we might rely on different techniques. We might try to persuade them using appeals to ethics. We might try to persuade people by making appeals to emotions or even appeals to reasoning. These are all rhetorical devices, and they're all being used by news sources. So getting clear on how are the news sources that I'm consuming, how are they using their language? How they use their language is going to tell you what their agenda is to some extent. Do they rely a lot on ad hominem attacks? Are they verbally assaulting other people? That's a description, that's a reflective description of the kind of character of the news source that you're taking in, right? So things to consider there. Here's an example though, a very simple practical example. When you describe a protest, that's a pretty neutral term. You describe a protest that happens in a city. If you describe it as a demonstration for justice versus a riot, we've now couched the term protest using rhetorical language, and those two packagings, they have very different impacts, and they're going to vastly sway the way people are able to think and interpret what the protest was. If you're thinking of a riot, we obviously have a very negative emotional reaction to it. We're thinking of, chaos versus a demonstration for justice. So for me, when I think of a demonstration for justice, I'm thinking of Martin Luther King, March on Washington. And when I think of a riot, I'm thinking of just just taking over a city and just like punk rock, burning everything down to the ground, craziness. And that's the intent. That's why we use language. That's why news anchors and people use these kind of languages, to get you to think in a particular way. But you have to ask yourself, what's the agenda happening? And should I agree just because of the rhetoric? And then finally, something to consider as well is we have to do independent fact-checking. The fact-checking has become a very fun word to use in the past 8-10 years. And it has to do with, when false information is given in news outlets, other news outlets will say, well, we fact-checked it and blah, blah, blah. That's great. I think fact-checking is great, but don't forget that we also have to do some fact-checking. So as critical thinkers, we're skeptical. We take nothing for granted. Nothing is sacred. This is kind of our mantra at this point, meaning we fact-check even those things that we trust, because that's what we do. And so we have to independently verify and fact-check all the information that's coming to us. And what that means is, like, essentially, when people are offering us arguments and giving us their arguments, they're giving us reasons and data and evidence. We have to look at the reasons, which requires just raw critical thinking and logical analysis. And we have to look at the evidence, which might include looking at statistical sources. I can never say that word. Statistical sources, and fact checking them, seeing, well, what is the quality of that statistical analysis? Is it a good representation of whatever it is that's being analyzed, and so on and so forth. We've studied this idea of analyzing information in depth at this point. So we know how to fact check in a way that's beneficial. So we have to do the fact checking. So these things collectively taken together, that allows us to challenge media bias. So again, I'll just reiterate, we can't really get away from media bias, I think, simply because all of us are engaged in the world, and everything's at stake for everyone. So we have opinions, right? And that's okay. We want to be able to trust the people that are informing us to inform us in a way where they're able to set their own opinions aside. It's really, really hard to do. And that's another point of this series, is it's really hard to do that, to think purely logically, because we're human. In fact, I don't think we want to think purely logically. This isn't human at all, actually. It's really beautiful to be flawed and human and emotional and all these great things. But so we have to do the work for ourselves, and making sure that the information that we take in through media is being filtered and proofed in these specific ways. Yeah, something else I'll say is we live in a bit of a... I'm not going to go too much into this because it could take a lot of time, and I haven't thought about it a lot for myself clearly, but we live in a post-truth age. This term has been used before. What this term means is it's identifying a phenomenon that's happening in the world, but it's not identifying the fact that there's no such thing as the truth. No one has ever demonstrated that there is no such thing as the truth. In fact, were they to do this, they'd be demonstrating the truth. It's a contradiction. It doesn't make any sense. There is such a thing as the truth. I promise you this. Understanding that, when we talk about living in a post-truth age right now, what that means is we're living in a time where our access to the truth is being obfuscated. It's being intentionally maligned so that we may not participate in the pursuit of the truth. This is what the post-truth age means. We are not being allowed to think critically and to participate in our society and our politics and the information in the world. It's being prohibited. We're being prohibited from doing that. That's what the post-truth age is, and that's why many of us probably feel like it's hard to tell what is true, what is false, what is real, what is fake. That's intentional. That's the point. But rest assured that now I sound like a UFO chaser. The truth is out there, folks. So that leads us to talking about misinformation and disinformation. I actually learned the distinction between these two. These two are very different. I learned the distinction between these two in the process of developing this course with Ben. So misinformation and disinformation are two phenomena that have significant implications in our information-saturated society. There's a sentence for you. Understanding the distinction between them is crucial for effective critical thinking and informed decision-making. So misinformation refers to incorrect or misleading information shared without malicious intent. So the intention, so impact, bad. Intentions behind the misinformation, not bad. It was a mistake. It happens all the time. In contrast, disinformation involves the deliberate spread of false information with the intention to deceive, to obfuscate, or to separate, right? To scatter. This is where not only is the impact bad, but the intentions are malicious. They intend, whoever is giving this information intends to prevent you from having the truth and preventing you from participating in the truth. You're being put out of play. That's the difference here. The first thing to do to combat that, of course, is to fact check. Independently fact check as best as you can. That might mean, of course, that you're given a statistic, it's false either for whatever reason, whatever intention behind it. Then you realize, actually, the statistics that we even rely on collectively aren't very good. We collectively as a people, we actually don't know the truth about this. So we can't even begin to make false or true claims about them because we don't even have any information at all. So that's not a great outcome, but that's possible where we actually don't know the truth. I wish I could give you an example of this, but we'd actually have to collect more information to even back up the smallest of claims. Of course, you might get to a point where you look up some information, you're like, wow, that's completely false, or this has been cherry picked, or incorrect use of sample size, et cetera, et cetera. But fact checking is your friend. So here's an example of misinformation. A social media user posts an out-of-date fact about a healthcare procedure, something like this, and it goes wild on social media, and then suddenly everyone's talking about it, but it doesn't mean anything at all because when you check the facts, it's based on out-of-date health information. Now, the social media user didn't intentionally mean to deceive. Maybe what they meant to do was intentionally get a lot of clicks and likes, but they didn't mean necessarily to inform or disinform, right? They just made a mistake, or the malicious intent isn't really there. It's a lack of care. It's a lack of intention in the sense of, I was optimizing for clicks, not for informing. That's what social media influencers do, by the way. They're there for intention. They're not there to inform you. I'm sorry. Disinformation example, a politician who blatantly lies about something to obfuscate. So I'm not going to bite. I'm not going to talk about that, but it's out there. This happens all the time across the aisle. Information is being maliciously twisted, bent, obfuscated in order to support a narrative that is either detached from reality or wholly detached from reality. It's being done for that reason. It's being done so that you don't know. It's being done so that a false truth can be constructed and then sort of post hoc push the world into that direction. It's very malicious. It's very nasty. It's very nasty. Disinformation and conducting disinformation campaigns, or however you want to say that, is a very nasty thing to do. And it's very the word isn't derogatory I want to use, but this doesn't sound good either. It's very disrespectful to the autonomy of the individual. So it's very un-Kantian, Kantian ethics, the idea that we respect and recognize the autonomy of ourselves and others. This is not what disinformation is about. It's absolutely about shattering and disrespecting the autonomy of ourselves and others. It's very, very unethical is the point I'm trying to make. Something else to consider. When you're looking at information, misinformation, disinformation, media sources, social media, whatever it might be, think about who or what is backing that information or supporting that news outlet. In the US, we don't really have anything like free public news sources. All of our news sources are owned by someone. And the people that they're owned by have a high stakes in what that news source is giving out. So to give you an example, I believe it's the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos. If you don't think that Jeff Bezos has any impact on what the Washington Post is doing, you're confused. It's not nice to say, but you're confused. So this is happening across the board. In fact, in the US, the public news information sources that we have, the public news institutions that we have are being actively defunded now. Think about that. So consider these things when you're taking in information, is who's backing them. Now, again, thinking critically here, just because, to use the example, Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post doesn't mean that the Washington Post is not a good source of news. That's not what that claim is making, right? But it's important to think about it. Consider it. What influence and what impact might he be having? He's having an impact, not on the entire thing, of course, but he's having an impact. So thinking critically about that and analyzing that. And then finally, when it comes to misinformation and disinformation, having gone through this lecture series, we're really well equipped now to tackle misinformation and disinformation, only because we're pretty well versed, or at least introduced to, informal fallacies and cognitive biases. Disinformation and misinformation rely solely, almost I would say, are entirely on informal fallacies and cognitive biases, plus rhetoric, right? Everything is rhetoric, or everything goes through the channel of rhetoric. So None of us can really get away from using or falling prey to the fallacies and biases. This is just part of the human condition, but we can work at getting better at avoiding them, right? And we can also get better at identifying them. And so when we're looking at information, seriously, actively look for, is this person relying on malicious attacks of character in things? This is called ad hominem. Are they using malicious attacks on people to avoid talking about whatever it was that was being discussed or brought up? For example, I think politician A has a great idea on how to fund public education. Well, that's fine, but that person's a dummy, right? You can't trust that person at all. Also, they ruined healthcare and blah, 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 and you start going on a tangent. Okay, you're just attacking the person. You've said absolutely nothing about their policies. You've said nothing, period. That's it, right? So, and we can do that. We don't have to think a lot now we don't have to think a lot now at all about this. Like, this is just bad thinking. And so anything that's coming out of that is highly suspicious. Anyways, to draw it back, focusing on those identifying any uses of the fallacies and the cognitive biases in the information. That's going to tell you, it might even help you identify whether we have an instance of misinformation or disinformation, depending on the kind of bias. Was it a mistake or was it an intention? And then how is it being delivered? Decision making. So critical thinking, of course, is amazing for decision making. So critical thinking plays a pivotal role in effective decision making by promoting systematic analysis and evaluation of alternatives. This analytical approach enables individuals to break down complex decisions into manageable components, allowing for a thorough assessment of the potential outcomes associated with each choice. By engaging in the process, individuals can mitigate risks and enhance the likelihood of making informed decisions. Talking about this from a top-down perspective real quick, something that I've personally learned from philosophy, logic, critical thinking is that when you're encountering a problem, or you're encountering a challenge, or you're encountering a topic that you're learning about, diving into something at the coarsest level, at the highest level, and then getting more and more fine-grained is a very effective way at problem solving and decision making. So getting used to your theme or topic. So for instance, if you're learning about, we'll just say philosophy, you're going to start out very generally. You're going to start out, well, what is philosophy? It's the love of wisdom. Okay, that's entirely generic and not very informative at all, but at least you're moving in a certain direction. And then, as you get more and more specific, suddenly you'll be talking about the categorical imperative in Kant's ethics and blah, 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 right? Whatever. But going from general to specific. This is this technique is very beneficial for decision making and problem solving. So keep that in mind as we go through these examples here. So there's a lot of frameworks for decision making. Here's one that we can use, and that's known as SWOT. You might be familiar with it. SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And it's a framework for analyzing decision making and making deliberate choices or more clearly made decisions. So example, a company is contemplating launching a new product. They might conduct a SWOT analysis to identify, it sounds so funny, they might conduct a SWOT analysis to identify its competitive advantages. So the competitive advantages of the new product, the potential challenges or drawbacks of launching that product, market trends, so the opportunity, when's the best time to launch the product, and then finally external risks, which falls into the threat category. So, opposing companies with opposing products and so on. So a SWOT analysis in this sense is, just giving you a frame of reference and framing things so that you're able to think carefully and judiciously as you're making your choices. Okay, and then the next one is all decision making. Just by default, there's always going to be pitfalls in our decision making. We can correct for this to a large extent by taking time. So this is something I've tried to, in my more flowery moments, is take time for yourself, right? So this is very important, is taking time for yourself to think about stuff. This is not something that your environment that we live in, the environment we live in, not going to encourage you to take time. It wants to take your time. They don't want you to take your own time, right? for various motivations. We don't live in a world that's like, why don't you sit back, take a day or two, put your feet up, and just think about whether or not you want to do X, Y, or Z. No one's gonna do this. You have to take this time for yourself. Why? Why do you do this? Because you're able to slow down, to get clear, and to think. Humans are rational animals. This is kind of what defines us. We're thinking things. We're not very good at it. We're not very good at it at all. So we need time. We need time and practice. So just keep that in mind, that time is an essential ingredient for thinking well. Here's an example. 2008 financial crisis, which is about the time that I graduated high school. And I realized that nothing about what I was being told about the world and how the world would actually be would ever line up. And it hasn't. 2008 financial crisis. A lot of investors in this time, I'm not an expert on this, but a lot of investors in this time were moving fast. They were thinking and doing decision-making in a very quick manner. They were ignoring warning signs about the market due to overconfidence and a focus on short-term gains. So not only were they moving quickly, they were focused on the short term. As a consequence, obviously a very complex phenomenon. The financial crisis of any kind is a complex phenomenon, but we ended up in a recession and it sucked. That could have maybe have been mitigated by taking a little time and thinking a little bit more critically in the decision-making processes that were happening. Next, problem solving. So effective problem solving is a fundamental application of critical thinking, enabling individuals to navigate challenges systematically and efficiently. The first step in the problem-solving process is to define the problem clearly. This is very, very important. This involves identifying not just the symptoms of an issue, but its root cause. By focusing on the core problem rather than the peripheral symptoms, individuals can develop more targeted solutions. So the definition here of problem solving and how critical thinking impacts it, it's relying a little bit on an analogy with medicine, with health, and it's a good one. So if you're a doctor and you have a patient that has chronic headaches, and you're just giving them ibuprofen, what you're doing is treating symptoms. You're not looking at the root cause. And then, you do an MRI or whatever it is doctors do, and you discover the person has a brain tumor or something, I don't know, something horrible. Well, that's the root cause. You get rid of the root cause, then the headaches are probably going to go away. This is what we have to do with problem solving. Of course, this means we have to take time and do some careful defining and analysis of the problem. So that's the most important thing when it comes to problem solving, is defining the problem. If you don't know what the hell the problem is, you're not going to be able to solve it. What seems to be the case is that, and I think we're well-meaning as a species. Look at me talking about the human species like I'm not a part of it. I just showed up here on a ship. We love to there's a problem here, right here, and we haven't clearly defined it, and we start to get creative with our solutions, like try this, and we go flying down the road, and you're like, hold up, buddy, and you got to grab them with a cane on the stage, and yank them back and be like, hold on. We have to go slow, and we have to define the problem, because it's only then that we'll actually be able to come up with a solution to it. So, example, if a team is consistently missing project deadlines, we can come up with 1 million solutions to help people hit project deadlines. We can throw 1 million different project softwares at you. We can spend billions of dollars on this. We can get all the life coaches. We can change the teams around. We can do all this stuff. We can do this to the end of the moon, right? Not a phrase, but I think you know what I mean. We can do this to the end of the moon. I'm going to coin this phrase. Still not going to get to the root cause of the issue, to the root of the problem. So if a team is consistently missing project deadlines, it's going to be crucial to explore whether the issue lies, for example, in resource allocation or team communication or task management. And even then, we still have to go deeper. What about the task management? Where is the breakdown occurring? So what we see, again, is we're going from general to specific. Often we look at the general, like problem, solution, and we go flying down the road. No. We got to get really, really tight. We got to get in the pocket with the problem, and then we can move to a solution. This is also very efficient. So, it might seem like this would take a lot of time, but it's actually really more efficient, because if you're able to hone down on what the problem is very minutely, your solution is going to be honed down and minute. Therefore, it'll probably be pretty effective if you can come up with a solution at all. So while the front end work of defining the problem is very laborious, it goes quickly from there. So it is an effective use of time, even though it seems like you're moving slow. So one way to do that, of course, is the gathering, contextualizing information. So information that contextualizes a problem. So you might be able to define a problem, but remember, problems exist within a context. So trying to contextualize it. So for example, in a workplace setting, conducting a survey among employees surveys aren't usually very good, but conducting a survey among employees can reveal underlying concerns about workload or collaboration that might contribute to identifying why some team A or B is missing project deadlines. So finally, then, once you've identified, you really honed into the problem, being really flexible with the solutions, being creative, really think of it as an analogy of a painter. Like a painter, when they're painting a canvas, they don't just go bam, 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 bam. Well, that's not true. Some do, but it's not very good painting. But you go bam, 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 and then they're done, right? A very careful painter, a good painter, will take their time. They'll rework the painting. They'll rework the values of the light shades. They'll rework the characters. They'll build up colors. They'll remove colors. They'll do all these things. A very deliberate, creative, and flexible process to try to find the best way of depicting whatever it is they're painting, right? And we have to take that mindset of flexibility with our solutions. We have to be flexible with our solutions. Of course, and this is a bit of a sunken fallacy. We've talked a little bit about this, is when we put our chips down on a solution, we get really overcommitted to it. And it's like, no, this has to be the way that has to get fixed. Well, maybe it's not working, right? And so we have to be flexible with our solutions. So for example, if a company identifies a communication breakdown as a root cause of missed deadlines, try the new AI project management tool. Maybe it'll work. It's a creative solution. It's a new technology. There's a lot of people that advocate for it. A lot of people that are working on it. Maybe that's the solution. Does it work though? So the next stage for problem solving is that feedback loop. So we really want to focus on that feedback loop. Look at the impact of the solution that you're currently using for the well-defined problem. What impact is it having? Is it correcting it? Is it exacerbating it? Is it creating new problems? Is it solving the problem identified and solving other problems? That would be super awesome. But you have to do that feedback analysis so that you can remain flexible and change course if you need to in your problem solving. So maybe that AI management tool not solving the original problem and also creating even more problems in the company. So maybe don't use it, right? Maybe that's not the solution. Maybe there's a different solution. For example, how communication is used on Teams or something like this. I don't know, but something to consider for how problem solving can look. And then finally, let's talk a little bit about communication and how critical thinking can impact communication. So effective communication is an essential skill that is significantly enhanced by the application of critical thinking. At its core, effective communication involves clarity, precision, and the use of evidence-based arguments, all of which are informed by critical thinking processes, or they're conducted by critical thinking processes. When individuals engage in critical thinking, they become more adept at articulating their thoughts clearly and distinctly in a manner that is understandable, supported, and relatable to others. Being a critical thinker means defining your terms. This is something that we do as critical thinkers. I'm going to use the word extortion. I don't know why I'm thinking that word. I'm going to use the word extortion, and I'm going to use it in a very specific manner. I'm going to use it in this manner, whatever it might be, and then proceed to use that. The importance of defining terms and making your use of terms clear is so that other people can participate in the pursuit of the truth in the conversation that you're having. If I start using a lot of big words, or even small words in ways you've never seen or heard before, I'm not having a conversation with you. I'm talking at you for my own benefit. You're not being allowed to participate. You're not being encouraged to participate. In fact, you're being sat out from the conversation. Not very ethical, if you ask me. And that's why it's important. For just as a practical example, anytime, this is something I learned in my academic studies, anytime you hear an ism come out of your mouth, follow it up with a definition. Isms of any kind, existentialism, absolutism, idealism, all these terms, they sound really cool, usually because they're derived from Latin terms. So you're like, cool, I'm using a cool Latin term in an ism, and it sounds really awesome. But if you don't define it, you're not talking about anything. At least not in a way that's coherent or meant to have a conversation. And you might not even know what the hell it is you're talking about for yourself if you only talk about something as an ism. So it's really important to get clear and to define your isms. That's one way that we can be effective communicators. So when I talk about existentialism, for example, I'm talking about existentialism as it was defined by Jean-Paul Sartre in 1943's Being and Nothingness, right? Okay, now we know exactly what we're talking about and we can proceed moving forward. We're not talking about existentialism as we're thinking of Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Camus, and this entire 19th, 20th century tradition that's very loosely but totally poorly connected together. Very important, right? But you could talk about both of them using the same word. So define our terms. And what that does ultimately is you're avoiding ambiguity, or worse, you're avoiding vagueness. So to reiterate, I've said this before, but ambiguity refers to a countable number of definitions that can come along with a word, and vagueness refers to an uncountable number of definitions that can go with a word or phrase or whatever. So, for instance, Marxism is a vague term. There's that word can literally mean anything. It doesn't, and so it means nothing if you don't define it. Here's an ambiguous term. Ooh, can I come up with an ambiguous term off the top of my head? I can't. No, I'm under pressure. I can't do it. But think of a word that only has one or two possible definitions, right? Here's one. Nope, that's not one. I was going to say meerkats, but no one's confused by I just really have to talk about meerkats. But I think you get the idea. If it's like, well, what are you talking about? Are you talking about A, B, or C? Well, you got to define it. That's ambiguous. If you're like, I don't know what you're talking about, that's because it's vague. Practical example. A manager presenting a new project plan should probably clearly outline the objective, expected outcomes, and individual responsibilities. This is part of defining your terms and creating a cooperative and collaborative atmosphere. And this is just a part of effective communication. Before you go running down the aisle talking about all manner of things, make sure that everybody's on the same page to begin. Next, of course, part of effective communication is supporting your claims. Pretty much anything that we say, if it's a declarative sentence, it's a claim of some kind. And it might be such a modest claim that it doesn't really require a lot of evidence or support, but that would be something like all men are mortal. You don't really have to defend this claim. This is an analytic truth is what it's known as. But if you're making a bigger claim, remember, you have to support that claim with reasons and or support that claim with evidence. So if you're working in the abstract, you're probably going to be relying on reasoning skills. If you're relying in the concrete, you're probably going to be relying on statistical data, evidence of some kind. But make sure that you're using it and also make sure that you're communicating that with other people. So cite your sources. Very important, even if it feels unnecessary at times. Never take for granted the opportunity to inform someone else, to share what it is you do with someone else. Next is, of course, is to practice active listening and empathy. So just bearing in mind the general principle is that before you can respond well and effectively, you have to understand first. And in order to understand, you have to be quiet. You have to be quiet and you have to listen. And you have to listen with an open mind, skeptical but charitable, right? And moreover, empathetic. So when you're listening, don't be thinking about what it is you're going to say next. Take in the information as it's given to you. That's what active listening is. So that you can communicate effectively. It's a part of the pieces. Listening is part of communication. Of course, example here is a leader who listens to feedback regarding project challenges may uncover, and they listen to it actively and empathetically, may uncover underlying issues that require more immediate attention than was initially believed, thus enhancing team cohesion and morale, right? So maybe the reason why project deadlines aren't being met is because maybe some manager has a tendency of communicating in a sort of offhand manner with someone and blah, blah, blah. And, understanding that problem and the nuances around it and the reasoning behind that and just giving space for that instead of saying, you can't talk like that to your employees, right? Understanding that, you're going to be able to navigate that emotional reasoning landscape a lot more effectively. Outcome being, of course, team cohesion, team morale. Because who doesn't want a manager that listens? Who doesn't want a manager that is empathetic? Now let's dive into our final reflection session. So first question, in what ways has critical thinking already benefited you in your day-to-day life? Second, what are some additional ways that critical thinking can be applied to your day-to-day life? Finally, to what degree, if any, are you morally or ethically responsible for teaching others critical thinking skills, be those other people your friends, family, or children? Excellent. So today we looked at critical thinking in everyday life. We looked at how critical thinking can positively impact information overload, challenge and overcome media bias, challenge misinformation and disinformation, augment decision-making, streamline problem-solving, and enhance our communication skills. So that brings us to the very end. We're now able to look at the entire series in reflection here. So to restate, this entire series, Critical Thinking for the Rest of Us, has been about getting clear on what critical thinking is. The joke, of course, is critical thinking for the rest of us, meaning we love to use the word critical thinking, but it's not clear, let alone is it something that we can use effectively and begin to implement. Hence, well, what is it for the rest of us folks that don't know what's going on, which is probably all of us, right? So a goal of the critical thinking series, of course, has been to define critical thinking, but also to give you more and more actionable items that you can implement in your life to think critically in whatever capacity it is you find yourself in. And so the scope of this series has been looking at critical thinking and its key skills. And the goal, of course, has been to give you the tools you need to think critically. So to wrap up here, we began the series kind of loosely defining critical thinking as just thinking with good form. And then the formal definition, which we kind of dismissed out the gate, was critical thinking is the objective analysis and evaluation of information to form reasoned judgments. So my hope for you, my great hope is that at the end of this wild adventure, that definition makes a little bit more sense. It makes a little bit more sense what objective analysis is, what it means to evaluate information, and what it means to form reasoned judgments. And furthermore, my great hope is that you also know how to act upon that definition now in your life. So thank you so much for being part of this critical thinking series. I'm horrible at goodbye, so I really don't know what to say at this point. But yeah, thank you so much for attending, for listening in. And yeah, I'll see you next time.